In August 1947, a pen stroke severed the British Indian Empire, carving the modern borders of India and Pakistan out of a single landmass. The 17 years that followed, under India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, remained the most intensely debated period in the country's history. To understand this era, we have to bypass modern political demonization and official hagiography and look strictly at historical cause and effect. When Nehru took office, he assumed responsibility for an immediate, staggering administrative burden, governing 345 million people. This data dashboard displays the grim colonial inheritance India faced at independence. The national literacy rate sat between 12 and 16%. Average life expectancy was just 32 years, and economic output had stagnated, leaving per capita GDP at roughly $56. Simultaneously, the state was fracturing. The violent partition of the subcontinent triggered the sudden displacement of between 10 and 20 million people, threatening to collapse the new government under the weight of a staggering refugee crisis. The geography of the newly drawn borders compounded the economic shock. India lost its most productive, irrigation-rich agricultural land in the west to Punjab, and its crucial jute-growing raw material regions in the east to Bengal. Analyzing Nehru's policies requires acknowledging the 1947 baseline. He assumed command of an impoverished, deeply divided emergency. This presented a massive historical conundrum. How do you build a functional nation from the ruins of colonialism without centralizing power so entirely that you fall into dictatorship? The new administration did not have the luxury of sequencing its problems. It had to simultaneously construct an industrial economy, secure highly volatile foreign borders, and invent democratic institutions from scratch. The decisions made to solve these concurrent crises formed what we can call the 1947 blueprint. These policies enacted during this specific historical window act as the structural DNA for the modern Indian state. We can read this blueprint clearly by examining three distinct pillars: the economy, foreign policy, and democracy. By looking at the specific data, we can evaluate the intended goals of the time against the structural consequences they produced. In 1947, India's domestic private sector was exceedingly narrow. Domestic companies simply lacked the massive capital required to build the power grids, railways, and heavy infrastructure a new nation required. This scale illustrates the government's response, known as the Mahalanobis model. The Planning Commission made a deliberate strategic choice to allocate a disproportionate share of state resources into heavy industry and capital goods, while agriculture received comparatively little investment. The immediate result was a rapid expansion of national infrastructure. Massive hydroelectric dams like Bakran Angle were constructed to supply irrigation and power the newly formed electrical grid. The state also successfully established vast public sector heavy industries. Within a decade, massive steel plants at Bhilai, Durgapur, and Rourkela became the backbone of India's industrial manufacturing base. This state-funded push simultaneously established India's elite technical institutions. The creation of the IIT system and the foundational atomic energy program formed a scientific workforce that continues to drive the global technology sector today. But the trade-off for this rapid industrialization was severe. By severely underfunding agriculture in a country where 70% of the workforce relied on farming, the state perpetuated mass rural poverty and triggered crippling food price inflation. To manage this tightly planned economy, the government created a system that would become its most damaging economic legacy, the Licence Raj. Under the Industries Act of 1951, private firms were legally required to obtain government licenses to establish, expand, or even relocate their manufacturing capacity. This dense web of bureaucratic control protected inefficient domestic producers from competition. Instead of innovating, businesses spent their time securing rare licenses from government officials, creating powerful, structural incentives for endemic corruption. The long-term cost is visible in the data. Between 1947 and 1964, India's average annual GDP growth rate hovered around 3.7%. While this was positive, it severely lagged behind the rapid growth achieved by other Asian economies that adopted export-oriented private sector-led models. The state-led models successfully built the physical and educational infrastructure private industry couldn't afford. That the bureaucratic overreach it entrenched ultimately choked the very economic growth it was designed to accelerate. Outside its borders, the new Indian government navigated a highly polarized 1950s geopolitical landscape, where the Cold War pressured newly independent states to align with either the American or Soviet blocs. Nehru's solution was the non-aligned movement. By actively refusing formal military alliances with either superpower, India maintained its freedom of action, accepting vital economic and technological aid from both Washington and Moscow simultaneously. While this strategy secured India disproportionate diplomatic prestige and a powerful voice at the United Nations, it left the country without reliable security guarantees against immediate regional threats. The first major strategic consequence emerged in 1948 over Kashmir. Nehru opted to take the territorial conflict to the UN Security Council. Military strategists argue this was a deliberate choice that internationalized a dispute India was actively winning on the ground, yielding a diplomatic liability that remains active today. A second major vulnerability opened in the Himalayas. This map shows the result of the 1954 Panchsheel Agreement. By formally recognizing Chinese sovereignty over Tibet and relinquishing India's inherited treaty rights, New Delhi effectively removed the massive physical buffer zone that separated it from Chinese military power. Believing diplomacy would hold, the civilian leadership authorized the forward policy, pushing under-equipped Indian military outposts deep into highly contested border territories without the necessary logistical backing. The outcome was disastrous. In October 1962, Chinese forces launched a massive, coordinated offensive, rapidly overwhelming the isolated Indian positions and unilaterally declaring a ceasefire only after securing a decisive victory. Internal military inquiries revealed a brutal reality. Indian soldiers had been deployed into freezing, high-altitude conditions, lacking basic winter clothing, adequate artillery, or functioning communication lines. Historians remain divided on the root cause. Defenders argue India simply lacked the capital to fund widespread military modernization alongside civilian infrastructure. Critics point to severe political interference in military appointments and a tragic, naive misreading of Chinese strategic intentions. Ultimately, Nehru's idealistic foreign policy elevated India's moral standing globally, but it surrendered vital strategic leverage, leaving the nation with permanent, highly militarized territorial vulnerabilities. Judging 1950s India only against its own ideals can be misleading. We must compare its performance to its actual post-colonial peers. Look at this data table tracking newly independent and transforming nations between 1947 and 1964. The comparative record reveals a stark historical pattern regarding the survival of early democracies. During this exact window, Pakistan suffered a military coup in 1958, South Korea fell to a military dictatorship in 1961, and China's authoritarian consolidation resulted in the catastrophic Great Leap Forward, causing a famine that killed tens of millions. By contrast, despite mass illiteracy, extreme agrarian poverty, immense linguistic diversity, and the immediate trauma of partition, India sustained a functioning multi-party democracy. The Independent Election Commission turned democratic theory into a massive logistical reality, successfully administering 3 general elections and establishing electoral accountability as a strict norm. A robust constitutional culture was engineered through the collaboration of diverse intellectual leaders, allowing the passage of highly contested social legislation, like the Hindu Code Bill, which advanced legal rights and divorce provisions for women. Much of this stability traces directly to Nehru's personal conduct. He publicly respected adverse Supreme Court decisions, accepted the electoral defeats of his own party members at the state level, and willingly submitted to parliamentary accountability. In an era where military dictatorship and authoritarian consolidation were the statistical default for developing nations, establishing the rule of law as the expected, unbreakable standard was a significant achievement for a post-colonial state. Building a multi-layered state apparatus for hundreds of millions of people from absolute scratch is an administrative challenge with very few historical parallels. The ledger of the Nehru years contains undeniable failures. Ideological rigidity regarding state control suffocated private enterprise and delayed India's economic potential for decades. Strategic miscalculations on the borders yielded deep, intractable geopolitical conflicts. But the ledger also holds profound victories: the integration of a deeply fractured landmass, the survival of a constitutional republic, and the inception of world-class scientific and technical institutions. This decision tree illustrates the direct inheritance of the 1947 blueprint. The institutions and frameworks established during these 17 years, from the resilient public sector and contested borders to the technical boom and the Independent Election Commission, still function as the operating system of the country today. Reducing this era to a simplistic battle of heroes and villains obscures the mechanical truth of how nations are actually built, through highly constrained, complex, and difficult trade-offs. To understand the economic friction, the ongoing border disputes, and the fiercely vibrant democratic identity of modern India, you first have to read the blueprint